Hey everybody, this is your video on soldering. We do our first project, which is a flower, and everybody makes the same project. But I want to just kind of go through some of the things that you guys are going to need when you're soldering. First of all, you need a jig. That's just any flat board that has a right angle that's been nailed to it. You can use boards or rulers. And then I have these little strips of wood here and nails. And then you guys need a right angle tool, something that is like an architect square, and a hammer, and you need some flux, and you need some solder. And I have a big roll of solder right here, and we use 60-40 solder because that's just what we use. It melts really well. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure that this angle is also a right angle. And so, good idea to align one of these straight edges along with one of these boards. You should look straight down at it and make sure that this board is lined up. And if you've done a good job with your craftsmanship, it sets itself up. So you can look straight down at it. The camera is not at a good angle for you to see this, but it is where it should be. And then we just very lightly tap in the nails to get them in there. And all you need is a temporary setting of these boards on, because you're not trying to, you're not going to be using these permanently. This is only for the first step or two. And the first step is called tacking. And that is where we are going to be holding our pieces together with little dabs of solder. So first, in order to solder, you need flux. Flux means flow, and without flux, you can't solder very well because the solder will melt, but it won't flow into a bead, which is what you want. So I just spread it all over. And what this is going to do is it's going to clean off your foil from all the dirt and the oils and stuff, and then it's also going to, make your solder flow. And then to tell whether or not your iron is hot, you're going to take this iron, not directly over your project, but you're going to just cut through it with the very tip. Every once in a while, your tip does need to be washed off a little bit because there's a bunch of schmutz and dirt. So just with a sponge, just wipe it off every so often. And so what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to try and zoom in just a little so that you guys see this, is I'm going to show you how I go about doing tacking. Everybody's got their own way, but what I do is I have my solder right on top of where I'm about to put a little bit of, little dab, and I just take my hot iron and then I kind of mush it down. You'll hear a little bit of a sizzle, that's the flux. And you go around all your outside edges first, and that holds it together. And it's a pretty simple process. I'm going to zoom back out so that you guys can see this. So I'll just go through. I'll go around and do the tacking. And you only tack the first side. You don't need to tack the second side, and we'll get to that in just a second, but you only tack the first side. And you're just trying to put a dab of solder there just on the foil where other pieces come together, so all the joints. And so then I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the joints on the inside of this window. And so go through, and you don't need much. Another way of doing this is to be right over your project, take a little bit on your iron and it sticks, then dab it, just touch it to the foil. The iron will heat up the foil, and then that deposits the solder right on the foil. So I'm going to put it at all the places where they connect. And this is just good because you want to make sure everything is together. Okay, so now I got a little bit of solder there. So, okay, so now your project is tacked. So you see all of the pieces have a little bit of solder right where all the joints are. And so now we take the boards off because we don't need the boards anymore. you give yourself a little bit of space. So you've only hammered them in just enough so that you can take these boards off with your fingers. Just pry them off. So now I'm going to actually solder. And when I solder, I like to have a little bit of room around my project, because you'll see what happens with the solder when you have a little too much and you're trying to not let all that solder stay on your window. You're trying to remove it. So here's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to make this look really easy. I am going to start at an outside, sort of at an edge here, and I'm going to drag my solder, drag the iron across the foil like this. And I'm feeding the solder right on the iron. And I'm going to just go right back over that. And I'm going to carry a little bit of extra solder. Looks like I need a little bit more flux. The flux is going to make this melt a little bit easier. So I'll show you this real quick. So I'm going to let this set up for just a second. Depending on the flux that you use, sometimes you have to reapply your flux a lot. And we use kind of inexpensive flux. I'm not going to lie. The more expensive flux that you use, I think the less you probably will have to apply it. And so it will make the solder behave better if you use better flux. So here we go. So that's what you see. You see it flowing like this. And so I've just spread all the extra solder that I've just deposited onto the foil. I'm spreading it all around here. Okay, so that's what a good solder seam should look like. If you kind of bounce some light off of it, you can see that it is a bead. It's a raised and rounded seam. And so it's nice and smooth. You don't have a bunch of blobs all at the joints here. And so I'm going to continue. Make sure I don't have any glare. Reposition and show you what you're doing here. So I've reapplied the flux. I'm going to go through and I'm dragging, again, dragging my iron over the foil. There. Now that's exactly what it should be doing. Any extra goes off and it forms into this little solder blob here. Just be careful not to touch those because they look the same molten as they do when they're set up. So again, I'm dragging the iron along the foil and I've got the piece of solder right in front of the iron. So it's melting. It's feeding right on the iron there. Some people will solder with the piece of solder right on top of the iron. I usually put it right in front of the iron because I'm just feeding the solder right on the iron. Okay, so there's the extra. And when I go over a seam, I usually start right at a joint and then I go back over it. You can bring, if you go over a tack, you can just use that solder without any extra. And as I'm soldering, this little piece of solder is getting shorter and it's getting hotter. Just because we all learned in science class that metal conducts heat. And it was a truth. So we grab some more solder, another small piece, and we just continue on. And you don't want to put too much solder on here. You really only need just enough to coat the foil and enough to deposit a bead. The bead is slightly raised and rounded, and it's, you know, this is all flux coated, so it's kind of yucky and gross. The flux will lift all of the dirt that was on your foil. It will lift it up to the surface, so all of that dirt floats on the surface. So this is what you want to see. You want to see that it's nice and smooth. Careful to spread the solder around if you see there's way too much in the joints there. Okay, so then you have all this edge foil here that has not been covered. We treat the edge foil by doing what's called tinning. Tinning is just a common term that we use throughout stained glass for coating the edge foil. And so all you're going to do here is you can either do this when it's flat, but your iron already has a bunch of solder on it. And so all you do is as long as there is flux on your foil, you can drag your iron all along it like this, and it deposits solder on there. So if you find that your foil is being resistant and it's not accepting the solder, just add some more flux. And then you're going to do the outside edges. And do the outside edges, I usually just hold it at an angle like this, and then I drag the iron down. So I'm going to put a little bit more flux on here along my outside edges. And if there's any blobs of solder that are sticking to your foil, those get melted off. But be careful when you go to do this, because any solder that drops onto your board sometimes splatters, and it'll catch you in the arm and it'll burn you. I mean, and it's very, it's usually a minor burn, but still, it's a burn. These irons, when they're brand new, are 900 degrees. I'm serious. 900 degrees is pretty hot. And the solder melts, at least that's what the package says, melts at 375. So, again, still really hot. If you've touched a hot pan coming out of the oven, it still hurts. So you run your finger under cold water, and hopefully everything is okay. Maybe you have some aloe vera or some sort of burn stuff. So this is tinning. Tinning is coating all your edge foil. All right, so then, once you've got the front side done and you've got your edges tinned, then we need to wash off the flux, because you don't want to keep the flux on both sides, because we've got to do the back side. All right, so we have to wash off the flux. So what you should do is take it to the sink under warm water and wash it off. Just take it, warm water. Make sure that the water is warm first, because if it's cold, you'll get a crack or several. Put some soap and get the flux off of there. And then you're going to do the back side. So for me, I am wiping this off. You guys are going to take it to the sink, but for me, I am wiping this off here. Okay, so I'm getting all the flux off. The numbers come off with mineral spirits or some other solvent, so don't worry about the numbers yet. So now we do the back side. The back side, you can see solder has already come through. If you have any spaces or gaps in between your pieces, the bigger those gaps are, the more it's going to run through. So, because we've got a lot of heat that's going on. And so we're going to go really, really fast on the second side. So, we've turned it over, we've washed the flux off the first side, and now we're going to apply the flux all over the second side, and we're going to do this very quickly. That's the thing to remember about the second side, is to go and do this very, very quickly. So you've got your solder. I'm going to take about a foot or so at a time. You can cut it off. And then start soldering the back side. So I'm going to reposition this a little bit over here so you guys can see. And now I'm going to start again. So again, you just go really quickly. The idea is to try and deposit the right amount of solder with the right amount of smoothness and not have to go back and do touch-ups. I have a lot of students that do a really messy job on their solder, and then they say, oh, I'm going to go back. Try and minimize the amount of time that you spend going back and redoing your solder seams. Your foil will thank you, because your foil is sensitive. The adhesive kind of gets activated when you start soldering. I have a little bit of resistant foil there. I'll have to put some more flux. But the adhesive gets activated with heat, so it makes it stick a little better. But if you keep going over and over and over your solder seams, your adhesive starts to give out, and it starts to seep out from underneath the foil. So you'll see your solder, and then you'll see this little black stuff kind of coming out from the outside edges of your solder seams, and it's kind of gross. And you go, what is that black stuff? Well, that's the adhesive crying for help. So I'll go back over. And so again, you see how fast I'm doing this. And I'm just going to keep going. If you have any foil that's still exposed, you cover it. And so again, I'm going pretty quick. And you know, been doing this soldering thing for years, so I'm making it look really easy. Now on the second side, you're also going to get air bubbles, and they're going to kind of pop out at you. There's air bubbles here. You can kind of see them. So try to minimize the amount of times, again, I'm saying it, that you go over and over and over. Okay? So now you see there's some blobs of solder on your outside edge here. When you go to tin this backside foil here, you can just take it and melt this off. But you see how when it splats onto the jig here, it may splat you because you've got all kinds of solder splatter that either hits your glass or it hits the jig and then it splatters on you. So just be really careful. Okay, so now I'm going over all my solder, all my foil, and getting all of this all tinned. So any blobs of solder are coming off. Okay, so now on both sides I have a nice bead of solder. Now it's pretty hot, so you gotta be careful. So you can look at it, and I just happen to be really lucky. It didn't run through in any areas. If it does run through, you can melt it off. You can just put your iron behind it, kind of melt it off a little bit, and then go back over the little area. But a word of caution. If you should happen to accidentally drop a big, huge blob of solder like this onto your project. So let's just act like it was right here. You splattered a whole bunch of solder on your project, on your glass like that. Don't take this 900-degree iron and start moving it around on your glass. That's bad, because you are going to get a big, huge, angry crack right in here. Cracks are bad. So you wait for it to set up and you pick it off, because it's only stuck to your glass by suction. So now you're finished with both sides, and once you've got all of your edges all tinned, once the edges are all tinned and your front and back is good and it's exactly the way you want it, then you're done soldering. Then you can wax it. You can wash all the flux off. You can get the numbers off with some sort of solvent, mineral spirits, acetone, paint thinner, and then wax. So you're done. Da, da, da.